All right, everyone. So welcome back for the second of our big idea speakers. And really, really pleased to have Dr. Kemi Jona with us. And just before we get started with him, who's, by the way, crossed several barriers in order to technical barriers in order to join us. But before we get started and before I give the floor, virtual floor to Kemi, just a little bit of housekeeping. Most of you have already found it, but there's a lot more happening on the website besides just the sessions that we're running. So if you haven't logged in yet, it's lxconf.co, and you can go in there and participate in other ways in the conference. And you can also use the hashtag LXConf on Twitter, which has been going like mad this morning. And we're really pleased to have people from all over the world joining us. I think at last count we had about 15 different countries, so that's great, and kind of across all of the different time zones as well. There's some Open Studio projects going up for people to, we've just had our first Open Studio live session. There'll be another one later today. But we've also had some Open Studio projects starting to go up, and people are looking for feedback and to share work in progress. In fact, Karen, who was participating earlier, is going to put her PhD research project that she's working on up there to get some feedback from everyone as well. And then later today, we'll have Dr. Yeshai Moore, who will be joining us from Israel. Don't forget that you can go into the hallways, because that's where the best conversations usually happen at conferences, and that the badge competition is still going. I'll probably be issuing that prize later today. And then the idea for the big ideas sessions is that we've got some opportunities for asking your questions early. So if you're looking ahead to the rest of the week, go and see what everyone's going to be talking about and make sure that you get your questions in early. And but you can also just pop the questions in the chat as we go along, and I will be noting those down for our Q&A session later, and we can continue the conversation throughout the next few days. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Kemi's slides. Okay, and I'll just do my formal introduction. So Kemi is the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs and a Research Professor in Computer Science at Northeastern University. And he's also the founding director of the Lowell Institute. And I knew that I wanted to invite Kemi as soon as he started to talk at the ODLAC conference, where I saw him speak a few months ago. This was another beaming session, so he was coming in from across the world. One day we will be in the same country, maybe even in the same room together. But because what he was talking was exactly the kind of things that I've been talking to people about right before that session started. So I was like, yes, but obviously verbalized so much more clearly. And with all of these really practical projects that Kemi's already been working on, and things that he's been putting into use, not on a small scale, but at a really large scale. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Kemi again today, and I hope you all will too. So with that, Kemi, I'm going to give it over to you, and like I said, I will rudely interrupt you after about 40 minutes.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Joyce. I really am honored to be here. This is really a first time in terms of a global online conference. So I'm really excited to see people coming together around a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is learner experience design. So thank you for taking the initiative to bring us together and to allow us this forum to share our ideas. I wanted to spend the time together with all of you talking about a platform strategy for enabling next generation learner experiences. And I know this is something that all of us in our own ways are working on in various perspectives. And so I'm really looking forward to keeping my comments relatively short and then opening it up for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So just to kind of start things off, my argument here today is that technology has largely been used to sustain rather than transform the infrastructure for and the practices of learning. And while certainly there are pockets of true innovations to be found, and certainly some that are created, in fact, by those of us here today at this conference, I would argue that those are still largely the exceptions rather than the rule. And by and large, when we look across the entire education sector, we don't see really breathtaking transformation. And instead, what we see is largely what I would argue sort of sustaining innovation. So for example, taking us from in-person lectures to online lectures, that the kinds that we see in MOOCs and in a lot of online, at least academic courses, although perhaps less so, in corporate learning and development. Similarly, we've gone from paper and pencil tests and grade books and Scantron sheets, at least that's what we call them here in the States, to the ubiquitous online grade book and online tests. And for those of you who have kids in school, this is the principal interface by which principal technology by which you interact with your children's learning at school, in which they tend to be obsessed about way more than whatever it is that they're learning in class. And so, my question really to all of us, the challenge I think that we're all here to talk about is asking really, is this the best that we as a community can do? And, again, my point here is that we as a field, learning design and learning generally is lagging behind innovations in other sectors. And what I hope to do today is to kind of make the case by comparing where these other sectors have moved to, particularly in the way that they've embraced kind of digital platforms. And hopefully what I'd like to do is try to draw inspiration from some of these examples, and then I'll share one brief example of some of the work that I've been doing in a project for middle and high school students. But what I'm going to hopefully end up with is 3 strategies that we need to pursue, all driven by better use of these digital platforms in learning. So the first is that we need to create platforms that enable us to better capture and leverage rich streams of learning data. And no, I don't mean grades and test scores. I really mean the kinds of rich data that exist and that is being harnessed in a lot of other applications. So for example, one of my favorite, and maybe you're familiar with it too, is an app called City Mapper that takes, for example, here the London Tube, the London Underground, which is just a completely complex, impenetrable system for many people, especially if you're not from there, if you're traveling, and creates this beautifully simple interface that allows you as a tourist or whoever to really get from say Heathrow to King's Cross, the Central Station, gives you all kinds of different options, and tells you how much each is going to cost, and really helps you navigate through this sort of old-fashioned infrastructure, if you will, this century-old infrastructure of travel. And so, the key piece here is not just that it creates this really user-friendly experience, if you will, this traveler experience by analogy to a learner experience. But the other thing it does is that everyone who uses the app, it harnesses all of their data and it shares it back for yourself. For example, every time you do a commute, it tracks it on the left here, and you can see, for example, how long it took you yesterday or the day before, and gives you sort of a faster, slower piece of feedback. It tells you in aggregate over all of your commuting trips, how you're doing, what the times are. You can see them down here. If you choose different lines, this is a New York example rather than a London example. If you went, if you took the 2 and the B, how long does that take you versus the 3 and the 4? So it allows you to sort of compare and contrast your commute performance, if you will, over time. And it just, really begs the question, well, what if we were able to do something like that for learning performances, your learning trajectory, your learning pathway over time as well? And so beyond the individual feedback, it also aggregates the feedback and the data, I should say, across everyone in the city who's using the app. And so, for example, here you can say, your commute basically is 25% shorter than everyone else who's commuting in the city. So that's just an interesting factoid, but you can imagine it being a much more useful piece of data comparing how you're doing with others or how to optimize perhaps what you're doing. It also shows you in aggregate, for example, how everybody else is commuting to work and how they're spending their time. And so between walking, waiting for trains, and riding trains, you can see the breakdown. And you can also see here in a San Francisco example, what are the different modalities people are using to commute into work. And so I think it just sparks my imagination around what would something like this look like if we had a digital platform for learning that would provide these kinds of really useful pieces of analytics to both guide my own sort of autonomy and agency as a learner and empower me in making better decisions or more informed decisions about how I'm doing, what efficacy I'm having in terms of the various alternative learning modalities and that sort of thing. So I think it's really exciting to open up those kinds of possibilities. Another great example, and another one of my favorite apps, maybe yours too, is Waze, which is used to navigate, and I find much more intelligent, for example, than Google Maps or my built-in iPhone map. And one of the things that makes it so powerful is that a lot of, if not most of the data coming back in terms of traffic and other things are provided by fellow users. So there's no central headquarters at Waze where people are in a giant room madly typing away traffic data. It's all being picked up by how fast you're moving with your app on your GPS and being fed back to the database. Not only that, but all of the other reports about where the police might be hiding or if there's a car pulled over. These are all reports shared by other users of the app. And so again, you can really see the potential for leveraging the power of peer learners, in this case, peer users, of people sharing tips and insights. And certainly there are a lot of analogs in community sites, boards, other things like that, where this kind of thing is happening. But I would just really love the sort of graphical simplicity and access. And again, you have to use this while you're driving. So there's a real premium on not being distracting and getting the information to you just at the moment of need. And I think Waze does a really great job of doing that in a way that inspires me for learning design to make this something as easy to use and as just in time as Waze is. So, behind all of these platforms is a rich treasure trove of information. So this comes from an animation, a data visualization that I can't share because this is a static screen, but allows the user at Uber to move their mouse around and then see graphically all of the trips that originate or end at that particular destination. So this is a map of Manhattan and trips to, I believe, LaGuardia Airport. It's either LaGuardia or JFK. I can't quite see. Maybe you guys can recognize it. And again, you can just imagine a version of this map for a learning designer that might help you visualize all of the different learning pathways that a learner chose to navigate through your particular learning application or learning ecosystem. And then try to make sense of how you might want to optimize something like that for them. And again, one of the cool things that we know about Uber, for example, is that there are no real dispatchers in the system. So here's another animated map. If you want to go see it, you can follow the URL at the lower left there. That animates all of the trips in LA across a 24-hour period. And the richer the line, the brighter the line, the more trips that took that path. And so again, there's no central dispatch like there is in the world of antiquated taxis, but rather the system itself is routing and directing drivers to where the need is. And one could again imagine in a learning context, mapping out all the pathways that learners are taking, and then helping us to identify, for example, where are the learning deserts? In Uber, they might be saying, well, where are there no cars? Where do people want rides, but there are no cars? How do we create a surge pricing to attract drivers there? Similarly, what would a learning desert look like if you had a map of all of your learner pathways through your application, your ecosystem? And as a curriculum or learning designer, you could ask yourself, where am I missing important elements of content or skill development, such that I could help my learners complete their intended pathways as they've expressed on the platform. I think the excitement of something like that and the power would really be a tremendous leap over what we've got today, which is still a very largely manual, design-intensive process of sort of handcrafting or hand building these pathways, if you will, for our learners, rather than sort of harnessing this data and then providing ourselves tools to visualize it. So my second argument here is that we need to create platforms that not just harness this data, but also that integrate with each other and then share data. And also by that, I just want to point out that when I mean share data, I mean share data in ways that benefit the learner, not just the platform owner. And for those of you in the US, you probably saw a big piece in the Sunday New York Times about how Google has taken over at least the US education market with Chromebooks. And there's some controversy about what data they're collecting and how they're using that data from kids. So I want to be clear that we want to be talking about how we share data with each other's platforms in ways that benefit learners. And so again, one of my favorite examples of this, if you haven't noticed in your Google apps recently, is they've integrated ride sharing into it. So, in addition to just say, for example, picking public transit or walking or biking, you can now click on the rideshare app and you get a couple of different options. At least I do. On my phone, I get Lyft and Uber, and they both pop up. And then for example, here on Uber, it's showing me all of the different kinds of Ubers that I could take, and also how many minutes away that particular Uber is. And if I want any of those, I can just click the next button. It will actually launch the app with my origin and destination. Here I was plotting a path from my office at the university to the airport, for example. And the important thing here, aside from just how incredibly convenient that is the fact that both Lyft and Uber have created a mechanism by which they can share data with the Google app platform, or Google Map platform, I should say, and provide not just the location of the cars on the map that you can see, but also the relative pricing for their various services that are available in that area, how many minutes away. All that data is being shared across these digital platforms in order to create what I would argue is a much more compelling, seamless user experience for me as someone who's using Google Maps. And then once I figure out where I want to go, makes it really, really easy and seamless for me to actually get there. And so, of course, it's naive to think that there are no examples at all. And I think there are plenty of examples, and maybe we can talk about some of your favorites in the Q&A. But there are some digital platforms that I think are beginning to provide a glimpse of how this might work. And certainly the one that comes front of mind, I think, for myself and many of us is, the MOOC efforts, Coursera, edX, and others. Khan Academy has really significantly enhanced, their platform and the data that they're collecting and the pathways that people are taking through it. So I think we're starting to see examples of that, whether they're open and sharing data like we saw with the Uber and Google Map app. I'm not quite sure. I doubt. There are others, a couple examples that I want to share next. One is from an open learning community. An example from Big Data University, which is an IBM offering for open learning. And then some, again, open badges at IBM and an app from the General Electric company for professional development. So let me just show those to you real quickly, and then we can move on. So IBM Big Data University is a free, open self-education website to teach you analytics and data science. They've got about 600,000 users. They issue badges, so about digital badges. They're issuing about 10,000 credentials a month now, and have issued around 90,000 credentials last in 2016. So pretty substantial learner community there. And you can bet that IBM is sitting on a huge treasure trove of data around who's earning these credentials, that you can share the credential on your LinkedIn profile. So they're doing the data sharing that we talked about. So there's some really interesting efforts that are happening here in the private sector with industry. Another really interesting emerging example is an app that General Electric is using to essentially replace their annual performance reviews and appraisal process. So rather than waiting once a year to sit down and talk with your manager about how you're doing and where you need to improve, you can ask for insights from various mentors or coworkers, which is essentially asking for feedback. And so it provides a mechanism by which you can give and receive feedback or performance appraisals in real time. And of course, it also is at the same time building a network of sort of a social network or knowledge network of people who are asking for feedback from others, which can then be turned into a very powerful, I think, learning network and learning application. So those are a couple of examples that I think are interesting and worth following. And the key point is that the data from these digital platforms can really provide new tools, not just for learners and educators, but also for us as learning designers and a curriculum design community as well. So let's talk about that. And I think there's, excuse me, 3 particular ways that I think that can manifest itself. So one example that I'll offer is a project that that I've been working on with my colleague Reed Stevens, who's at Northwestern University, funded by the National Science Foundation. And it's a project called Fuse, which is really essentially a digital infrastructure for learning and engagement for middle and high school students around STEM and STEAM learning. And the website contains about 24 different challenges that learners can select. You can go check it out at fusestudio.net. And it's a free choice environment, so students can pick any challenge they want to work on and then level up across any of those challenges in robotics, 3D design, 3D printing, all kinds of different STEM and STEAM topics. And one of the cool things that we can do then is we can harness the data coming off of this. And what you see here sort of in a colorful dot diagram that one of my grad students, Lauren Penny, generated is across an entire school year on the horizontal axis, you can see different patterns of challenges, and the bigger the dot, the higher up in the level that student went. And on the left side are two sixth grade students, one on the left, one on the right. And the one on the left, you can see sort of jumping around, trying a lot of different challenges. The one on the right tends to sort of pick a particular challenge and then sort of stick with it all the way through. And neither one of them is better or worse. They're all different patterns of engagement. But the data and the platform allows us to kind of see and examine these different patterns and try to understand why students are making those choices and what kinds of decisions those are with respect to what they're interested in and how they're working with themselves and with their peers. You can also map this out in terms of aggregate interest in the different challenges across an entire school year. This was September through June here in the United States. And the width of the line at any point talks about the relative popularity of that particular challenge. You can see them down the right side there. And so, a narrow band of color means not very popular, and a very broad band at that particular point means a very popular, challenge as sort of adding up to 100% across all of them. And so again, as a learning designer, I can ask myself, why are some challenges sort of going viral and becoming more engaging? What are the mechanisms at play there? How would I support those mechanisms if I wanted to enhance, the uptake of a particular challenge or not? And just in case you're curious, this dip in the middle here is essentially winter holiday break, Christmas break, where the usage dropped down, and so kind of disrupted the normal flow of the data. And finally, we can also peel apart the data. We can ask questions, for example, like, do boys and girls prefer different challenges or different levels of different challenges? So here was an analysis we did that looked at, which challenges are more preferentially chosen by boys versus girls, with sort of parity being right down in the middle here, sort of at 0, sort of no preference one way or the other. And we can ask ourselves whether we are, as designers of this environment, serving boys and girls equally well. So this data came from over 3,300 participants, representing about 11,000 different data points. So very robust set of data across lots of different implementation sites that allow us as designers to go back. And for example, what we did here is we looked at this robot challenge at the very, very top of your screen here, and we said, well, what could we do to make that much more appealing to girls? And we actually went through and redesigned it, and were able to achieve much greater gender parity there. So it was a mechanism by which we as designers harness this data. And so finally, and I won't say much more about this, I've kind of put this in as a prompt for some Q&A, but certainly if we're ever going to leverage AI in the way that we see other industries doing it in other sectors, then we have to be able to expose this rich data stream so that we can have AI technologies be brought to bear to enhance the teaching and learning experiences that we're creating. And so as we think about designing next generation learner experiences, my argument, my takeaway to all of you today is that we have to design systems not just for the learner, but also very intentionally with the goal of harnessing meaningful data streams. So we have to design for data, in other words, for data capture and data leveraging. Learner experience design is really going to be increasingly focused on what learning data you are generating and how you are leveraging it, not just the end user experience. And so I think the 3 ways that that's going to manifest itself is empowered decision making for learners. So for example, where am I now? We saw some examples from Google Maps and from Waze. Where do I want to be? What are the equivalents to Uber and Citymapper? How have other learners gotten there? For example, by Waze, showing how other drivers have navigated. What else is interesting nearby that I haven't yet explored? What was the experience of other learners who went there? So for example, the kinds of advice that you might get from other travelers if you were using the TripAdvisor app. Secondly, I think the data can be used to build tools for enhancing instructor, mentor, or facilitator capacity. And I think this will really be the low-hanging fruit. So for example, providing learners with automated or semi-automated feedback and coaching. We see some of this happening with customer service environments right now that use AI to provide some semi-automated or automated responses. Certainly more timely, formative, just-in-time feedback to support learner iteration and mastery-based learning is something that has been a holy grail for learning designers for many, many decades. Providing better visibility and insights into individual learning pathways and patterns of misconceptions to help me as a coach or an instructor do a better job of supporting my learners. Analysis of patterns of group performance and misconceptions. So if I have a cohort of learners, whether it be in a formal learning environment like school or a corporate learning and development course, are there patterns that might illustrate gaps in what I've, as an instructor, provided that might help me come back and address those misconceptions across the entire group. And finally, I think there's a lot of promise in automating the lower complexity tasks to free up time among the coaches or instructors for higher complexity tasks that they would probably prefer to be doing, but maybe are bogged down by some more administrative duties that we could automate. And finally, and I think importantly for our conference and our conversation today, tools for enhancing the learner experience designer's capacity. So, we showed some examples today of providing visibility into patterns of efficacy, equity, and interest in the Fuse example that I shared. If we take to heart the idea of Uber sort of dynamically, changing surge patterns, then we can imagine sort of constant alignment or realignment, and maybe an end to the static curriculum as we know it. And then finally, the sort of the goal of having maybe constant feedback for learning and development, like the app, the PD at GE app that I shared. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for thinking about how the data streams could be harnessed to enhance what we as learning designers do for a living. So with that, I'll wrap up. I think I'm just on time. Joyce hasn't logged on to yell at me yet. And we can open it up for what I hope to be a really interesting Q&A session. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm back after fighting with my microphone. Thanks, Kemi. I did not yell at you, and you are indeed even early. I am going to open it up for questions. Oh, you're getting some applause, as you can see from the applause icons. Just a question to everyone. If you have Tamara got in straight away. If you've got your microphone working, which means you've got a microphone icon behind your name, then you can actually ask your question live. So just use the hand raise icon to indicate that you're keen to ask a question. It's just down there where you see the little smiley face emoticon as well. All right. But in the meantime, I've got tons of questions myself, Kemi, but I'll let you get to Tamara's question. And her question is, what do you see, if any, the role of geospatial tech to be in terms of capturing student data? So I guess Tamara is how can this inform how we design experiences for our students, the use of geospatial tech? Oh, I've just unmuted you, Kemi. Go ahead.
I was waiting for that. Thank you. So thanks for that question, Tamara. Certainly a lot of the examples that I showed today were very rich in geospatial. So I think it's a very relevant question. My sense is that geospatial is just one type of sort of contextualizing data. And so certainly, we understand it to be sort of contextualizing from a geographic standpoint. So what am I near? What restaurants are near me? What tourist sites are near me? And so, apps like Google Maps or TripAdvisor can tell you, things like that are adjacent to you. So, whether we think of that as an analogy or we literally harness geospatial, for example, you could imagine, and in fact, we're working on this right now, some training and education programs for advanced manufacturing, people who are working on a shop floor, right? Whether GPS will actually work, indoors at that level remains to be seen, but one can imagine location-sensitive coaching, feedback, and other kinds of resources brought to bear by which instrument or tool you're standing near. And certainly we've seen applications, the sort of HoloLens and Google Glass, sort of augmented reality that I think will hopefully at some point bring that to life and harness it. I think the other one that I think is really promising, which maybe could be a next-gen version of the GE app, is who is near me that has the expertise that I might need for a particular challenge or problem that I'm working on, right? So It may very well be that, going online using Slack or whatever tool you might have is one way to do it, but sometimes you want to just be able to wander over and talk to somebody who knows what you need to know. So I think that that's one possibility.
Absolutely. And Braun is just noting there in the chat window, and I've had some experience of this myself because I've been inspired by the work that museum experience designers do in this work. The way that they work on tracking users, I should say persons, after we listened to to Indy this morning, but that's how we track persons through the museum and how they interact with the exhibits and trying to denote patterns in their usage and behavioral patterns so that we can actually respond to them. But musea are doing amazing work in experience design. So if you haven't been looking at that, that's just for everyone else. Look into what the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, what does the A stand for? And musea. It'll come back to me. Te Papa in New Zealand, Braun mentions there as an example. So, but that leads us to the question that Dan's just asking, which is, do our students, our users, the people that we design for, do they mind being tracked, and how do we deal with the ethical side of that, I suppose?
Well, I think that, the geospatial question does sort of make it very concrete, but I think that, for example, the New York Times article about Google education apps, I think asks the question more broadly, which is collecting data, what data for what purpose? And I think we absolutely have to engage as a community around the ethical discussions around that, right? I mean, certainly, I've painted kind of the optimist picture here, which is, let's harness this data, to benefit learners, instructors, and ourselves as designers, which presumably we all have fairly aligned goals with respect to supporting the learners. But absolutely, you can imagine a variety of ways that a company might track their employee learning, which they do already. Schools might, have other mechanisms by which they would want to track it. And certainly we need to, like in healthcare, make sure that we're empowering individuals with the autonomy and agency to make decisions about what happens with that data and where it gets shared.
Mm-hmm. Just a very quick question from Anna Maria, who says, what was the name of the tool or site that you mentioned that can help you find experts?
Oh, I mean, I was referring to the Slack tool, which is really a group collaboration tool. It wasn't particularly sort of finding an expert finding tool, but certainly if you knew someone at work who was an expert, you can just sort of go on and sort of instant message them for a quick Q&A, right? Which is really kind of the intent of that kind of tool, but it doesn't really help you find experts in a particular way like that.
Yeah, I'll just pop in and ask a question that I've got, because I think I started this I was talking to Spiros about this after hearing you at the ODLA conference, this idea of having I suppose like a Spotify for learning. You kind of referred to that idea today as well, of where you just have a much larger ecosystem that people can move through. At the moment, like if you think about something like that, you kind of have to start thinking about the granularity of the offerings that you have. Like if you think about the granularity of the offerings that we do now, you're looking at a 4-week course, a 6-week course, a 14-week course. Very hard to get any kind of meaningful, responsive data for that, and really kind of hard for people to easily switch and change their learning behavior between that as well. Whereas if you think about something like Spotify, like there's like a song is small, right? And how you listen to that, how often you listen to that is going to give you much more data. So what do you think about the right level of granularity? Do we need to start designing in a different way so that we get more meaningful data?
Well, I think you ask a good question, Joyce, but I think there's actually two different questions that are embedded in there. One, which is the sort of granularity or chunk size of the learning resources, the curriculum, right? And then there's sort of the granularity of the learning data. And those are two different, I mean, they're related, of course, but they're two really different questions. And so, regardless of what choices you're going to make with respect to curriculum design or learner design, I think that absolutely, as we move learning increasingly online, my point here is that we have to design it in a way that surfaces much richer streams of data, not just on individual learners, but also on, for example, important sort of 21st century skills like collaboration, teamwork, other things that we, as a society or as an organization, value for learners. So, for example, just to get back to Slack, since I see the conversations continuing on the chat room, you can actually get access to the Slack data via an API, and you can harness or do analytics on who's talking the most to whom and other things like that as measures of collaboration. Certainly open source coding communities have rich histories of who's doing code commits or uploading code and can really mine that data. And if you go to the Wikipedia sort of authoring changelog, you can see again who's participating in what way. There's a very rich data stream there. But to your second part of your question, Joyce, I mean, I think absolutely we have to think very hard about the kind of transition, for example, that central taxi dispatch did for many, many decades, and this sort of user-defined, community-defined dispatch that Uber and Lyft and others represent, right? Where there isn't sort of a Wizard of Oz learner designer at the center of that universe making all decisions about what's best for every possible learner, right? It's something we all struggle with. But thinking about how do we open it up to empower sort of learner agency through a platform that has this data, and then put the sort of pathway decisions into the hands of learners to navigate, in whatever way they think is optimal for them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. I'm just going to ask to see if anyone else has got a question for Kemi through the chat or by raising your hand.
I should have done a whole talk on Slack.
Yes. Well, believe me, this conference only exists because of Slack. That's how it's all been put together. So I have a question, because you talked about the end of the end of the static curriculum, and I just noticed that there is another question there, but I'll just ask this. You talked about the end of the static curriculum, and I think one of the interesting things about educational organizations, this is perhaps not so much for corporate training, but certainly for educational organizations, is that we're really strongly governed by the government. And so if you're thinking about like a dynamic curriculum and kind of a change at the level of the ecosystem, really, how do you propose that we involve the government in kind of adapting regulation? Who's doing the advocacy around that?
Well, again, I think you hit on a really important point, which is innovation that sits within these regulatory authorities often sort of hits a brick wall, right? When you're trying to, for example, I think, the hidden version, part of your question is, for example, how do you move from a system that regulates seat time in terms of awarding credit to something that recognizes and is based around actual learning outcomes, right, or competency-based approaches. It's certainly a struggle that is happening here in the U.S., and there are certainly some examples where the regulations have come around to supporting it. So, for example, Western Governors University, I think, has now hit something like 60 or 70,000 learners primarily online, and does a very sort of competency-based approach. And so, I think one of the wins, if we take seriously this idea of creating these platforms that harness more data, is that we end up aligning ourselves much closer with what regulators are concerned with, which is ensuring, that students are getting served adequately and appropriately, and preventing fraud and sort of bad actors from, taking their money and providing no value, right? And so I think that in the sort of advancing the idea of more data is better than less data, right? In terms of, look, I can show you a semester long trace of this student going from, A to point A at the beginning to point B at the end, and acquiring a whole, raft of skills and knowledge, as opposed to just a single grade data point at the end of a semester, which says A, B, C, D, whatever. It doesn't tell you anything really about, what their capacities were. So I think that, that does align with, the kind of general interest that a government regulator would have, although I'm not naive to think that having them change their attitudes about it will be a slow and laborious process for all of us.
Yes, indeed. I'll just open it up to questions. Anyone else?
Braun, you should know I went to grad school with Barry. Small world.
Okay. So good question from Tina, and in fact related to something that I had as well, which is, you talked about this Wizard of Oz learning designer, and I've been thinking about where learning designers traditionally sit, particularly in higher ed, because that's where I've been working for the last 10 years, but even in corporate. What is our role? We're often seen as a support role. And yet I think if we move in this direction, then learning experience become much more tightly tied to whatever the business of the organization is. So the learning design becomes much more tightly tied to whatever the business of the organization is. And so it means we need like new skills, and maybe we need new roles. I know that EdSearch has had several conversations about the idea of learning engineers. I've talked about the idea of learning experience architects. Do we need different roles? And so Tina is asking, what resources, periodicals, blogs, researchers, conferences, anything do you recommend if we want to kind of move more in this direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say off the top of my head. There are communities that are emerging and researchers that are emerging around this. So, for example, Victor Lee at Utah does some really interesting work around quantified self. So, taking the Fitbits that we all wear, putting them on kids in gym class, and then allowing them to use that data to understand something about their, health and physiology and respiration, other things like that. So he's coming at it from the perspective of using sort of health data in that kind of a way. So I think that that's a great vision. We had a workshop recently in about a couple of years ago, maybe now, in New York around different ways that are bringing data together. And I think there should be a report coming out around it. We actually, one of the keynote speakers was a population biologist who was doing tracking of zebras via sort of video from like a helicopter as a ways of using sort of location data. So in many respects, other fields are way out in front of us. Again, I think the museum community is among the leaders in some of this, again, because they're in a much more sort of dynamic and elective environment. So I think that, they've been pushed to innovate in those sorts of ways. So, the examples I gave in my talk today all come from outside the learning arena primarily, just because I think that we see really inspiring roadmaps that as a learning design community that we could follow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's why, we organized this conference as well, is because we just wanted to connect people and kind of find out what's happening in all these different spaces. And what we can be learning from each other, because there is so much. But I'll definitely be sure to pop all of those things into the conference site. Gosh, Tamara, that would be amazing. And I've been thinking about this as well. You have to consider those. So Tamara's saying, what about ambient computing and how tools like Alexa might impact the future of instructional design? So I guess an opportunity for you to do a little bit of future gazing, a little bit of ideation. How could you see something like Alexa work? And just think, we haven't even got Alexa here in Australia yet. So.
Oh, really? Wow. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that's interesting about, Alexa and these other voice first interfaces is the kinds of transformations that in thinking that it poses for us as designers, in the same way that I think we saw the transformation in user experience design when mobile first hit, right? And the kinds of interface simplifications and interface metaphors that sort of took over kind of from a web native design, and we went to sort of responsive design, or mobile first design or app design, first, and then maybe sometime later the website would show up, but it was really mobile native and mobile first, and forcing us to rethink, the way that we interact and really simplify that. And I think voice first is just another step in that direction, which really, I think, emphasizes appropriately the nature of the interaction that's happening between the user and the system, or in our case, the learner in the system, and moves away from what I think is often an unhealthy obsession with interface design. And it's not to say that, I'm not a fan of good interface design, but in my view, I think instructional design historically has been way too wrapped up in interface design and way less wrapped up in learning design or what the nature of the learning interaction itself is. And so if we ask ourselves what the interaction is, we might be able to play that interaction out just as productively with voice as we do with anything that we put on a screen with a keyboard and mouse. And so I think it really helps us distill it down to its core essence.
Yeah, I agree. And there's an old TED talk which showed off this device called the Sixth Sense, and was already starting to address that right as we were starting to really see this explosion of mobile phones. But they had created a setup that would allow a human to actually interact with the world without having to go through that awkward point of having to pull the phone out, looking up what it is that you want to do. The ambition of the research project, and it's fun to go back and look at it now, but the ambition of the research project was for someone to just be able to move around in the world and have the information served to them as they need it, and be able to interact with that information through voice control and through gesture control, rather than having to go through something that then almost becomes a barrier from you actually interacting with your environment. So,
right.
Yeah. And I've just popped a reference in the chat channel there. There's a book called The Best Interface is No Interface. So it's a very quick read. I think it was actually originally a Medium article that's been expanded, but that's an interesting one to read. All right, we've got 4 minutes left, and I'm just going to see whether there are any final questions for Kemi from everyone. I don't see any hands raised and nothing else popping up. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for Kemi for being so generous with your time and sharing your expertise with us. It's been really, really good. And I'm sure that your conversation together with what Indy shared with us this morning are going to, stir up a lot of good conversations over the next few days. So we'll be reporting back. We hope you can still join us. We know you're really busy, but you've got the logins. We hope to see you in the conference site if you can, or in one of the other sessions. And with that, I'd just like to see an applause from everyone to thank Kemi.
Well, thank you guys for all the great questions and keep up all the great work. Keep pushing the field forward.
Thank you so much. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.